night on the open road has its own kind of silence. It's a silence that doesn't sit still but stretches out across the asphalt, through the empty parking lots, and into the long corridors of headlights that fade into the dark. When the world around you falls asleep, something about the highways feels different, wider, deeper, almost expectant. Even the air seems to hold its breath, waiting for the next pair of headlights to break the stillness. This is the hour when truckers settle into their rhythm, alone with the hum of the engine and the endless horizon, trusting the road to stay ordinary. But the night has ways of changing things. What looks familiar in daylight can turn strange when only your headlights reveal the edges of the world. Shapes on the shoulder seem to move, rest stops feel too quiet, and empty mirrors feel like they're reflecting more than they should. The people in these stories weren't searching for anything unusual. They were working, traveling, trying to reach another town before fatigue set in. Yet somewhere between mile markers and moonlit fields, they saw things that didn't belong to the world they knew. These accounts come from long-haul drivers who spend more time in the dark than most of us ever will, people who understand the rhythm of the night better than city lights or crowded streets ever could. When they say something felt wrong, it wasn't a fleeting thought. It was the quiet kind of realization that seeps into your bones, the kind that stays with you long after the engine shuts off. Their stories remind us that vast, empty places aren't always empty, and the road doesn't always travel alone beside us. So settle into the darkness with me for a while. Let the hum of your own room fade, and imagine the stretch of a lonely highway where only one set of headlights breaks the dark. These stories aren't loud or frantic, they're quiet traces of moments that should never have happened. And tonight, we begin with the first one. I've driven long-haul routes for years, and most of what I've seen on the road is the kind of ordinary strangeness you eventually stop noticing: fog rolling low across the pavement, animals darting out of fields, shadows that stretch too far under the headlights. Mile 47, though, that stretch has stayed in my mind in a way nothing else ever has. It's an empty portion of highway cutting through farmland, flat on both sides with nothing but fences and the occasional distant silo. At night, it feels even emptier: no lights, no towns, no signs of anyone living nearby. That night I was already tired, the kind of tired where you start counting the minutes until the next rest stop just so you can walk around and clear your head. Everything inside the cab felt warm and familiar. The faint buzz of the CB radio, the soft rattle of coins in the cup holder, the steady vibration of the wheels on the asphalt. There was nothing unusual at first. The fog started about 10 minutes before I reached that mile marker, drifting in patches across the highway like slow-moving clouds. It wasn't thick enough to be dangerous yet, just dense enough to soften the edges of the world. I slowed down a little, leaning forward slightly as the headlights pushed weakly into the haze. That was when I first noticed something: a small shape on the right shoulder, dim and partly swallowed by the fog. It looked almost like a person walking, but the proportions seemed off: too narrow, too tall, and too still. I kept watching it out of the corner of my eye as I approached, expecting it to come into focus or reveal itself as a signpost or a bush. But as I drew closer, it didn't resolve into anything recognizable. It just slid along the edge of the fog like it was keeping pace with me. At first, I told myself it was the fog playing tricks on my perception. Everyone who drives at night knows how easy it is for shadows to become people and people to become shapes. But the longer I looked, the more I realized this wasn't the fog shifting. This shape was moving, not walking, not stepping, but drifting along the shoulder as if it were on rails. I eased off the gas without meaning to, a small instinctive hesitation that made the shape slow with me. That's when a small, cold weight settled in my chest. Nothing keeps pace with a slowing truck like that. Animals scatter, people step aside, even shadows pass quickly as the beam shifts. But this thing stayed parallel to my cab window as though it sensed me watching. I tried telling myself it had to be a trick of light. Maybe the fog was reflecting the headlights strangely or bouncing off a piece of metal fencing. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Every time I blinked, the shape seemed to shift slightly, not in the way fog curls or drifts, but like a person adjusting their posture. I felt myself gripping the wheel tighter, leaning closer to the window without meaning to. When I glanced back at the road, the shape momentarily slipped out of my peripheral vision, and the moment it did, a sharp instinct hit me: look again. When I did, the shape was closer than before, no longer gliding near the fence but right at the edge of the asphalt, matching the exact speed of my truck. The fog thickened then, rising in heavy swirls that made it harder to see. The moment it covered the shoulder completely, I felt a bizarre relief, like maybe that thing would disappear back into nothing. I pressed the accelerator slightly, hopping to put some distance between myself and whatever I'd seen. But after only a few seconds, the fog thinned again and the shape was still there, only now directly aligned with the passenger door. I didn't see distinct features, no face or limbs or clothing, just a tall, thin silhouette that didn't move the way anything living should. It shifted closer, so close that for a split second I had the suffocating impression that if I reached out of the window, my fingertips would pass straight through it. The skin on my arms prickled with cold. I forced myself to focus on the road, counting the seconds until I could reach a wider stretch of highway and maybe pull over. But the feeling of someone right beside me moving without sound, without breath, made my pulse thrum unevenly. Then came the strangest moment. The shape stopped keeping perfect speed. It slowed just slightly, hovering near the rear end of the cab. I glanced into the side mirror, expecting to see the empty road. Instead, the mirror caught it perfectly, a tall, thin outline standing just behind the cab, not fading, not dissolving, but simply there. Its outline flickered at the edges, like whatever it was couldn't hold its shape entirely. I stared long enough to feel a cold pressure crawl up the back of my neck, and as soon as I looked forward again, the truck hit a smooth dip in the road. That brief motion was enough. The shape darted forward, reappearing beside me again, almost pressed against the edge of the truck. I couldn't see its face, I don't think it had one, but I felt its attention, a heavy, quiet awareness. I hit the gas harder, heart pounding, desperate to reach the next lit exit. The fog pushed in harder, almost swallowing the beams as the truck surged ahead. For a few long seconds, I didn't dare look to the right or in the mirror. As I kept my eyes locked on the glowing green sign ahead, when I finally sped through the last patch of fog and into clearer air, I chanced a look. The shoulder was empty, completely empty. No fog, no shape, nothing but flat, open road. I didn't pull over for another hour, not until I reached a busy truck stop filled with lights and people and noise. I sat in the cab for several minutes before turning off the engine, listening to the slow tick of the cooling metal. The world outside was ordinary again, so ordinary that it almost made what I'd seen feel distant and unreal. But when I climbed out and shut the door, I noticed something that made that heavy feeling return. Along the right side of the truck, just below the window, there was a thin streak in the condensation, as though something tall had passed close enough to brush against the metal without making a sound. I've driven past mile 47 many times since then, always during the day, always with the sun high enough that the shoulder is just empty land. But I never forget how the fog moved that night, or how that shape followed me like it was waiting for me to notice it. And every once in a while, when the road goes silent and the fog starts to creep in again, I catch myself glancing at the shoulder. half afraid I'll see something gliding along the edge of the world, keeping pace like it never left. I've driven through that desert stretch more times than I can count, long straight miles where the world feels hollow after dark, and the horizon disappears into a thin line of dust. Most nights I don't see a single car for over an hour. The only light comes from my headlights and the small glow from the dashboard, washing the empty road in a pale yellow that always feels too small for the darkness around it. That night I was in the middle of a delivery run, drifting in and out of that quiet rhythm truckers know well, the hum of the engine, the soft rattle in the glove compartment, the faint whistle of wind slipping through the mirror seals. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Just another silent road, another late hour, another few miles to go before stopping for coffee. I noticed her long before I reached her, though at first she didn't register as a person. Just a pale, upright shape on the shoulder, unmoving in a way people rarely are. Most stranded motorists wave or pace or at least turn toward approaching headlights. This figure did none of that. I squinted, slowing just a little as the headlights reached farther into the dark. The woman stood beside a silver sedan with its hazard lights off, hands at her sides, head slightly tilted. Something about her posture felt strange, too stiff, too balanced, like she had been placed there rather than having stopped there. The desert wind blew steadily across the road, but her clothing didn't move at all. As I drove closer, the unease settled in the back of my mind like a slow, cold weight. I told myself it was fatigue or maybe the way shadows distort things at night. But when the beams hit her directly, the first real oddity hit me. The car she stood beside looked perfectly fine, no flat tire, no smoke, no door ajar, nothing about it said breakdown. And the woman didn't signal me, she didn't raise a hand, she didn't step back, she didn't even turn her head. Just stood there, facing the road at an angle, her face partly lost in the glare. I remember I let my foot hover over the brake pedal as I passed, debating whether to stop. That tiny hesitation was enough to let a new thought slip in. Why wasn't she reacting at all? By the time the truck pulled even with her, I had slowed enough to get a clear look. She looked wrong, not deformed or monstrous, just strangely motionless in a way no tired or scared person ever is. Her face was pale, but not in the sickly way, more like the moon had washed all color from her. And when my truck crept past, her head turned, not quickly, not smoothly, just a slow, deliberate tilt until her eyes aligned with mine through the window. There was no expression, no fear, no relief, no urgency, just a blank awareness like she had been waiting for me to pass. For a second, she seemed almost translucent in the hazy glow of the headlights. That was the moment my stomach tightened. Something about that lack of reaction, that waiting, hit a part of me deeper than fear usually reaches. I kept driving, telling myself to get to the next exit and call it in. Maybe she needed help but was in shock. Maybe she wasn't able to wave me down, but the explanation didn't sit right. I checked the mirror, thinking I'd see her silhouette shrinking behind me. Instead, what I saw made my breath catch. She was standing in the middle of the lane, the same lane I had just driven through. The same place where she could not physically have reached in the few seconds since I passed her car. She wasn't walking toward the road or moving into position. She was already standing there, directly behind the truck, facing my taillights without moving an inch. I blinked hard, gripping the wheel until my knuckles went pale. The road behind me was empty except for her, the silver car now far off to the side. I slowed, half expecting her to vanish or move, but she didn't. She just stood there, staring, the red glow of my taillights catching the edges of her face. For a terrifying moment, I wondered if I had actually hit something, if my mind had split the image into two impossible positions. But the truck hadn't jolted, and nothing was in the road when I passed. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the highway ahead, but that image clung to me like a cold hand around my spine. I didn't stop at the next exit. I didn't stop anywhere that night. I drove straight through until dawn when the darkness finally thinned and the desert returned to its dry, empty normal. At the first diner I saw, I pulled in and sat in the cab for a long time before going inside. My hands were still shaking. I told myself to eat something to let the night fade into a strange memory. But as I sat there, staring out the diner window at the rising sun, one thought kept repeating in my mind. The road behind me had been straight. No side paths, no ditches, nowhere someone could stand without me seeing them approach. The place where she appeared was physically impossible. Weeks later, I mentioned it in a truck stop conversation offhand, like a weird story I didn't quite believe myself. One older driver went quiet immediately. Another stared at his coffee like he suddenly remembered something. Finally, one of them said in a voice too calm to be joking that a woman had died along that same stretch years ago. Car accident, middle of the lane. Some truckers claimed to see her by the shoulder. Some said she appeared behind them. Others said she followed them for miles in the mirror before vanishing. None of them said her face had expression. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was a person, a memory of one, or something that didn't belong to the world we understand. What I do know is that every time I drive through that stretch now, I keep my eyes straight ahead and never slow down. I don't look at the shoulder, and I definitely don't check the mirror until I'm many miles past mile 47's end. Because sometimes, when the night is especially still, I get the strange feeling that someone is waiting beside the road again. Someone who doesn't move, doesn't speak, and doesn't need a working car to stand in the breakdown lane. I've relied on my CB radio for most of my driving life, not just for road conditions or chatter, but for the feeling of another voice drifting through the dark when the highway feels too big. Channel 19 is where truckers check in, talk weather, complain about traffic, or help someone find an exit in the middle of nowhere. On long hauls, especially at night, that faint background murmur becomes a kind of comfort. You don't have to talk to feel less alone. You just listen. That's how it started that night. A routine, quiet run through empty farmland with nothing but static, low engine noise, and the occasional voice rolling softly through the radio. The road was open, the stars were clear, and I felt more tired than usual but steady enough to push through to the next major stop. Somewhere around 2:30 a.m., as the fields turned into low hills, the usual static took on a strange fuzziness, like the sound had become too heavy, too thick. It wasn't uncommon for reception to fade, but this felt different, almost as if the radio were listening instead of broadcasting. I leaned forward and adjusted the dial, but the static only grew quieter, not sharper. That was when I heard it, a faint voice beneath the static, too soft to understand at first. I slowed the truck slightly, trying to catch the words. After a few seconds, the voice came through again, clearer than before, though no less strained. It was repeating something, coordinates, a set of numbers followed by northbound please. The voice sounded small, almost brittle, like someone whispering from a great distance. At first, I thought it was a lost driver or someone in trouble. But the coordinates didn't match anything I recognized, not a highway marker, not a town, not even a rural route. They pointed to nothing on my map, and I'd memorized that entire region over years of driving. I tried calling back, asking if the driver needed help, but the moment I pressed the mic, the static dissolved into total silence. Not crackling, not fading, silence, like the radio wasn't even powered. I checked the wires, tapped the side of the device, even switched channels. Everything worked until I returned to channel 19. Then the static returned with the same quiet, pulsing pace. The voice came back a minute later, repeating the same coordinates in the same strained whisper, but something had changed. The voice seemed closer somehow, not louder but more present, like it wasn't coming through the speaker anymore but from behind it. The hairs on my arms lifted. I tried to tell myself it was interference from another trucker, maybe someone using an old radio with bad reception. But as the whisper broke through the static again, I realized there was no road noise behind it. No engine, no wind, no background hum. Just the voice and the static breathing around it. I switched off the radio entirely. The cab fell silent except for the tires rolling over the asphalt. I felt a little foolish for how relieved I was. I kept driving, focusing on the next curve in the road, the slight shimmer of heat still rising off the pavement even at night. After a few minutes, I reached down to turn on the radio again, expecting the usual chatter. Before my fingers even touched the switch, a soft crackle rose from the speakers. The radio had turned itself back on. I froze with my hand an inch above it, watching the faint orange backlight glow steadily despite me never flipping the switch. The static pulsed once, long and low, then quieted. The whisper returned, but this time it wasn't giving coordinates. It said very clearly, "You're close." I don't think I've ever felt cold so quickly. My breath stuttered, and for one strange moment I wondered if the voice had come from inside the cab, not the radio. I forced myself to look around, checking the mirrors, the sleeper, the shadowed corners near the floorboards. Nothing, only the sound of my own breathing and the low hum of the truck. When I looked back at the radio, the backlight flickered, dim to bright to dim again, as though reacting to the whisper. I reached forward and yanked the power cord out completely. The radio died instantly. Relief washed over me for exactly 3 seconds. Then, with no electricity running to it, the radio crackled again. A soft, thin signal. And then the whisper, "Exit ahead." My eyes shot to the windshield. I hadn't seen any exits listed on the signs for miles. The highway I was on didn't have off-ramps for nearly another hour. But as I rounded the next bend, the fog thickened suddenly, pressing hard against the glass. The headlights struggled through it, and for a few seconds the world shrank to a narrow tunnel of pale gray. When the fog cleared again, a small exit appeared on the right, a narrow ramp leading to an unlit road. No sign, no markers. Nothing indicating where it led. My foot hovered over the brake. The whisper hadn't returned, but the silence in the cab felt tight, heavy, almost waiting. I didn't know whether to trust the fear rising in my chest or the small part of me that felt pulled toward that ramp, the part that wondered whether someone really was stranded out there and needed help. The fog shifted again, drifting like a slow breath across the road, making the ramp look even more like something that hadn't been there moments before. I didn't take the exit. I kept driving, forcing myself past the ramp until the fog thinned and the desert returned to its usual empty sprawl. Several minutes later, the radio, still unplugged, gave one final crackle, not a whisper this time, not words. Just a sound almost like an exhale, followed by a very soft, almost disappointed sigh. Then the radio fell silent for good. When I reached the next truck stop, I asked around about strange transmissions on Channel 19. An older driver went pale when I mentioned the coordinates. He told me in a low, steady voice that a trucker had vanished in that region decades ago. His last transmission was a whisper for help on Channel 19, repeating coordinates that led to a rest stop that once existed but was torn down and buried under new pavement. The exit was removed, the road repaved, and the route straightened. No trace left. But some nights when the fog rolls in and the radio static grows thick, drivers say the old exit appears again, just long enough for the lost voice to guide someone toward it. I still don't know if that whisper wanted help or company, but I haven't used Channel 19 at night since then. And every time I see fog bend strangely on an empty stretch of road, I check my mirrors and listen, afraid I'll hear someone breathe through a radio that isn't even plugged in anymore. I've always believed that rain changes the road more than anything else, not just the pavement, but the way the night feels around you. Storms make the world smaller, like your headlights are cutting through a curtain instead of air. That night, the rain was steady and rhythmic, the kind that feels almost hypnotic when you've been driving too long. My wipers beat a slow, heavy pattern across the windshield, and the soft drumming on the roof gave the cab a strange warmth despite the cold outside. As I was halfway through a long haul, counting the miles until sunrise, and everything felt calm in that quiet, late-night way only truckers understand. Just me, the road, and the hum of the engine smoothing out the hours. I first noticed the lights behind me about 2 hours past midnight. They weren't bright headlights, just a dim, wavering glow, almost like an old truck with failing bulbs. It didn't alarm me. Night drivers come and go, and sometimes you end up packing each other for miles. What struck me was how close the lights seemed, like the truck was tailgating without actually touching distance. I checked the speedometer. I wasn't slowing. The rain wasn't that heavy. I eased into the right lane to let them pass, but the lights moved with me, keeping the exact same distance. When I glanced at the mirror again, the glow swayed slightly, drifting within the lane as if the driver were fighting fatigue or slippery pavement. I expected to see the silhouette of someone hunched over the wheel, but even through the rain smear on the mirror, I could tell something wasn't right. The driver wasn't facing forward. It happened quickly, one passing glance, a flick of the mirror illuminated by lightning, but I saw it clearly. The shape inside the cab behind me was turned completely toward the side window, as if staring directly into the mirror, staring at me. At first I thought the storm was distorting reflections. I blinked, looked again. Another flash of lightning lit the highway for a brief moment, and the figure was still turned, not adjusting, not reaching for controls. Just sitting there with an unnatural stillness, face angled toward my truck like a passenger watching quietly. I told myself it was just the angle of the light, the rain distorting shadows. I sped up a little, trying to put more distance between us, but the lights didn't fade. They matched my speed almost perfectly, drifting whenever I drifted and slowing in the exact moments I slowed. The wipers kept thudding across the windshield as the rain thickened, but I could feel my heartbeat pushing faster than the rhythm they set. I adjusted the mirror, hoping the change would snap the illusion. Instead, the new angle made the figure clearer. The driver, or whatever was in that cab, was leaning forward slightly now, face still turned toward me, posture too rigid for someone controlling a truck in heavy rain. The descent into fear came gradually, like a slow tightening of the air. A long stretch of road curved gently to the left, and I used the chance to peer through the driver's side mirror. Even with the rain streaming across the glass, I saw it plainly. The truck behind me had no movement inside the cab, no hands on the wheel, no shifting weight, no sign of a living person navigating a wet highway. Yet the vehicle was perfectly aligned behind me, moving with a precision no distracted or sleeping driver could manage. That was when the dim glow behind the figure flickered, not like headlights reflecting off wet pavement, but like a weak bulb struggling for power. The light pulsed, illuminating the inside of the cab for half a second. In that moment, the face became visible. It wasn't leaning casually. It wasn't turning normally. Its head was pressed against the side window at an angle no person could hold without pain, cheek flattened against the glass, eyes fixed on the mirror as though watching my every reaction. Though the face didn't blink, it didn't shift. It simply stared with a pale, unmoving expression. I snapped my gaze back to the road, pulse hammering so hard I felt lightheaded. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to focus on the yellow lines slicing through the water. The rain picked up again, thick sheets slashing across the windshield. For several miles, I refused to check the mirror, terrified of what I would see. But dread has its own weight, and eventually I risked a look. The truck was gone. No lights, no engine rumble. Nothing but the empty highway disappearing into the darkness behind me. The relief that washed over me was sharp and shaky. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and loosened my grip on the wheel. The storm eased not long after, leaving the air washed clean and cold. I convinced myself I was exhausted, that the rain and the long hours had twisted shadows into something unreal. By the time I reached the next rest stop, I'd nearly talked myself out of feeling afraid. But while I checked the truck before heading inside, something strange caught my eye. The rain had wiped nearly everything clean except for a faint smear on the back of the driver's side mirror, a long, pale streak as though someone had pressed their face against the glass. I wiped it with my thumb, thinking it might be residue from road debris, but the smear was on the inside of the mirror's housing, not the outside. It was behind the glass. I didn't sleep that morning. I sat in the diner with my coffee, staring at my truck through the window, replaying the image of that face pressed against the side window of the vehicle behind me. The way it had stared, the way it never blinked, the unnatural way the truck had moved without a driver. In the month since I've asked around, quietly, carefully, most truckers shrug it off. But a few have gone still when I mention dim headlights in the rain. A couple have admitted, only after a long pause, that they've seen a truck trailing them in storms only to vanish without a sound. One driver told me he refuses to look directly into his mirrors when the weather turns bad. Not because of what he saw, but because of what he felt watching him. Now, whenever storms roll across the highway and the night feels too quiet, I find myself checking the mirrors more than I should. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I think I see that faint glow again, a dim pulse swaying behind me, waiting for me to look. I tell myself it's nothing. Just the rain, just exhaustion, just tricks of the dark. But deep down, I know the truths. Some rides don't end when the storm does, and some drivers never stop watching. I'd been driving for almost 9 hours when the fatigue finally settled into my bones. It was the kind of exhaustion that makes the dashboard lights look softer and the hum of the engine feel hypnotic. The stretch of highway I was on ran through miles of farmland and dry plains. No towns, no billboards, not even a gas station for nearly an hour. Just open road and the steady drum of tires on asphalt. I remember blinking a little too slowly, realizing I needed to stop before my eyes gave up completely. When I saw a small blue sign on the right, rest area 1 mile, it felt like perfect timing. I didn't remember ever seeing that stop before, but highways change. Maybe I'd just never been on this route at this exact hour. As I approached the exit, something felt slightly off, though I couldn't put my finger on what. The sign looked old, faded in a way that didn't match the newer reflective ones nearby. But the ramp was smooth, freshly paved, with clean edges that suggested recent maintenance. I took it anyway, grateful for a chance to stretch my legs. The road curved gently, then opened into a wide gravel lot surrounded by tall, unmoving trees. A row of cars lined the far side, older models, some with dust on the windows, some with frost beginning to form even though the night wasn't that cold. None of them had lights on. None of them showed any sign of life. I parked near the center and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle. At first, the quiet felt normal, peaceful even. But after a minute, the stillness became unsettling. There were no insects buzzing near the lights, no hum from distant cars, no wind moving through the trees. Just a heavy, stagnant silence that made the air feel thick in my chest. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my arms as the gravel crunched under my boots. The sound seemed too loud, like it didn't belong in that place. The restroom stood on the far side of the lot, dimly lit by a flickering lamp. The light buzzed faintly, but even that sound seemed smothered by the strange quiet around me. As I walked toward the building, I noticed something odd about the cars parked along the edge. They all looked abandoned. Some had a thin layer of dirt, others had leaves collected under the tires as if they hadn't moved in weeks. A few had doors slightly ajar, but not wide open, just cracked enough that you could imagine someone stepping out and never coming back. My footsteps slowed without me realizing it. As I turned in a full circle, scanning the lot again, half expecting someone to appear from behind a car or step out from the restroom. Nothing, not even the faint echo of movement. I used the restroom quickly, keeping my ears open the entire time. The fluorescent light buzzed in a strange rhythm, flickering just enough to make the shadows shift along the walls. I washed my hands and felt this creeping sensation that I was wasting time, like I shouldn't linger. When I stepped back outside, the silence felt heavier, almost pressing against my ears. I hurried back to the truck, ready to get back on the highway and shake off the feeling. I started the engine, pulled forward, and followed the signs toward the exit road. Oh, except the exit wasn't there. The path I'd taken in now led to a dead end, a loop of gravel that curved back into the lot. Confused, I put the truck in reverse, thinking I'd simply taken the wrong turn. I circled the lot slowly, scanning for the ramp. But no matter which direction I went, I kept ending up in the same place, the center of the lot, surrounded by unmoving cars and trees that felt closer than before. My palms began to sweat. The exit had been right there when I came in. As I remembered the curve, the trees, the sign that pointed back to the highway. But it was gone, completely gone. I tried turning off my headlights to see if I could catch a hidden outline of the ramp, some clue the lights were washing out. When darkness filled the cab, the lot outside seemed to shift, not visibly, not drastically, but enough that I felt a slow, creeping dread in my spine. I turned the headlights back on instantly, breathing hard. The gravel shone pale under the beams. The cars looked exactly the same except one. A sedan near the far end of the lot now had its trunk slightly open. As I stared at it, trying to remember if it had been like that earlier. I was almost sure it hadn't. I forced myself to drive again, circling the lot, searching for anything that resembled an exit. I drove slowly, headlights panning across the parked cars, the restroom building, the dense wall of trees. Then, as I came around the back side of the lot, I noticed something else. One of the cars, a dark green SUV, had fresh tire tracks behind it. Not old ones, fresh ones, tracks that hadn't been there minutes before. I stopped, breathing for a moment. There was no movement in the SUV. No lights, no sound. But the gravel behind it was disturbed, like it had just arrived or tried to leave. I put the truck in reverse and backed away from that side of the lot, my pulse thudding louder than the engine. The feeling in my gut shifted from confusion to something closer to fear, a deep, instinctive sense that I shouldn't be here anymore. I was being watched. I couldn't see from where, but I felt it with every breath. Something in that place was waiting for me to make the wrong move. Then, almost by accident, I caught something in my peripheral vision, a faint gap in the trees on the opposite side of the lot, just wide enough for a vehicle to slip through. It wasn't marked by signs or pavement. It looked more like a service road or a path carved by someone desperate. Gravel trailed off into darkness, rough and uneven. It wasn't the exit ramp, but it was something. I didn't think, I just drove. The truck lurched as it hit the rough ground, gravel bouncing under the wheels as branches scraped the sides of the cab. The gap narrowed, then widened again, the path winding through trees that seemed to lean inward like they were closing around me. I pressed harder on the accelerator, not caring if I damaged the suspension. I just needed out. As after what felt like several minutes of bouncing over uneven terrain, the trees opened abruptly, and the highway appeared in front of me, rushing past under the glow of my headlights. I merged back onto the road without looking back. My breathing was shallow, my hands trembling against the wheel. The rest stop faded quickly in the rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness. When I checked my phone later, I tried to find that rest area on a map, the exit, the name, anything. Nothing came up. No record of a rest stop in that location. No service areas for miles around where I should have been. I've driven that highway dozens of times since that night, always during daylight. And no matter how carefully I watch, no matter how slowly I go, I've never seen the blue rest area sign again. The ramp simply doesn't exist. But sometimes, late at night when I'm fighting off fatigue and the road gets too quiet, I'll spot a line of trees that looks a little too familiar. And when that happens, I keep driving faster than before because part of me still feels that if I slow down, the exit might reappear, waiting to pull me in again. I've done plenty of long hauls alone, and I've done a few with a partner, but I've never been fully comfortable with team driving. There's something about having someone asleep just a few feet behind you while the road stretches on in silence that always felt strange, like sharing a room with someone who isn't really there. But this run required two drivers, and my co-driver Mason seemed easygoing enough. We'd been switching off for hours at a time, one of us sleeping while the other pushed through the long stretches of highway. By the time midnight came around, it was my turn to drive. Mason climbed into the sleeper, muttered something about setting an alarm, and pulled the curtain shut while I settled into the seat and prepared myself for a quiet, uneventful night. The first hour was peaceful. The road ahead was straight, the engine a steady hum beneath me, and the air inside the cab was warm from the heater set to low. I remember glancing at the curtain once or twice, half expecting to hear Mason snoring, but everything stayed calm behind me. I had music playing quietly through the speakers, soft enough that I could still hear the faint rattle of loose items in the glove compartment and the occasional wind tapping against the door. Nothing unusual. Nothing out of place. Just another dark stretch of highway with miles left to go. The first irregularity came as a soft shift behind me, like someone adjusting their weight on the mattress. I didn't think much of it. Mason was probably settling in deeper. But something about the sound bothered me. It had a heaviness to it, like someone sitting up instead of lying down. I glanced in the side mirror, expecting to see movement reflected in the dim glow of the cab lights. Nothing, only my own tired eyes staring back. Another soft shift followed, this one a little more deliberate, as though someone had changed from lying on their side to sitting upright. I called back quietly, asking if Mason was awake. No response, not even a grunt. The music, the engine, the faint hiss of wind all continued as before, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was sitting up behind the curtain. I forced myself to focus on the road, hands tight on the wheel, telling myself fatigue was playing tricks on me. But when I changed lanes a few minutes later, a strange weight pressed gently against the back of my seat, not forceful, just a subtle shift of pressure, like someone had leaned forward and steadied themselves on the headrest. My pulse quickened. I turned down the music completely and listened. The truck filled with silence so complete it felt unnatural. Then from behind the curtain came a faint inhale, slow, controlled, not the deep, relaxed breathing of someone asleep. It sounded more like someone trying to breathe quietly, the kind of breath you take when you don't want someone to notice you're awake. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Mason?" I asked again, louder this time. No answer, no movement. Just that almost inaudible breaths. I debated pulling over, but the nearest exit was still several miles away, and stopping on the shoulder at night never felt safe. Instead, I flicked my eyes toward the reflective metal strip on the passenger door, a trick some drivers use to see behind them without turning around. For a moment, the reflection was just darkness and the faint outline of the seats. Then something shifted. A shadow, tall and narrow, leaning forward from the sleeper area. It wasn't clear, not distinct, but I saw it, the unmistakable silhouette of someone sitting upright behind the curtain. My throat tightened. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles went white, the road blurring slightly as my pulse pounded in my ears. I forced myself to call out again, louder, still no answer. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself the shadow was the curtain folding or a trick of the streetlights passing over the metal. But the next few minutes confirmed the fear rising in me. It's every time the truck swayed with the wind, something behind the curtain moved a fraction of a second later, like a delayed reaction, the way a person might shift their weight to brace themselves. When the next exit finally appeared, I took it without hesitation. The off-ramp curved into a small truck stop with only two other vehicles parked under dim yellow lights. I pulled into a spot far from them, killed the engine, and sat in silence for several long seconds, trying to steady my breathing. The air inside the cab felt heavier than it should, as though someone else was breathing with me. I turned slowly in my seat and looked at the curtain. It hung perfectly still, not even swaying from the truck's motion. I reached toward it with a shaky hand, hesitated, then finally pulled it back. The sleeper compartment was empty. The blankets were rumpled, but not in the way someone shifting around would leave them. They looked undisturbed, as if no one had ever climbed into them at all. Mason wasn't there. My stomach dropped. I checked my phone and saw a message from him sent nearly an hour earlier, a simple "taking a smoke break, be right back." I hadn't seen it. I had already taken off. Mason had never gotten into the sleeper at all. A slow chill crawled from my spine to my legs. Whatever had been behind the curtain hadn't been Mason. I stepped out of the cab into the cold night air and called him immediately. He answered on the first ring, sounding annoyed but fine. He stayed behind at the last stop, thinking I'd check the passenger seat before leaving. I apologized breathlessly, eyes darting back toward the truck as though expecting someone or something to climb out of it. When I finally ended the call and climbed back into the cab, the sleeper curtain hung open, the space behind it quiet and empty. But the uneasy feeling didn't fade, not when I checked the locks, not when I turned the key again, not when the engine rumbled back to life. Because deep in the corner of the compartment on the mattress where no one had slept, there was the faintest impression, the shallow outline of where someone had been sitting upright, perfectly still. I drove the rest of the night with the curtain wide open and the cabin lights on, refusing to glance at any reflective surface. And even now, months later, whenever I feel the slightest shift in the sleeper or hear the faintest sound behind me on an empty road, that cold, quiet memory returns. The memory of a passenger who was never supposed to be there, sitting just a few feet behind me in the dark. I've driven winter routes for most of my career, and I've learned that snow has a way of changing the world more completely than darkness ever could. In daylight, it looks peaceful, even soft. But at night, it becomes something else, a shifting, silent landscape where distance disappears and the wind carries sounds you can't always place. That winter, I was hauling a load through the far north, miles from the nearest town, cutting through long stretches of untouched snowfields that ran beside the highway like frozen oceans. The storm warnings had been mild, and I'd made the drive plenty of times before. Still, the cold had a deeper bite that night, and the air felt strangely heavy as the sun faded behind thick clouds. By the time the first flakes hit the windshield, I had settled in, telling myself it would be just another slow, careful drive through the dark. As the snow thickened, visibility shrank to a tight tunnel carved only by my headlights. The rest of the world dissolved into white, not swirling or chaotic, just an endless, quiet drift. I kept both hands on the wheel, easing my speed down as the road became slick beneath the tires. The radio crackled with static, and eventually I switched it off, leaving only the hum of the engine and the soft tapping of snowflakes hitting the cab. That's when I noticed something strange out in the field to my right, not movement exactly, but a faint flicker of light, pale and slow, like a lantern swaying in the wind. I assumed at first it was a reflection from the truck or a distant farmhouse, but as I rolled forward another few seconds, another light appeared beside it. Then another. They didn't flicker like headlights or shine like lamps. The glow was soft, almost underwater, diffused by the snow. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to make sense of it. The lights drifted parallel to the truck, maybe 20 yards away, moving too smoothly to be someone walking. I told myself it had to be machinery, a plow, a snowmobile, something. But the storm was too quiet, and there were no tracks, no engine noise, nothing breaking the pristine surface of the field. The lights moved silently, with a calmness that made my breath catch in my throat. Every few seconds they'd brighten, then dim, almost as if they were breathing. I tried to shake it off. Fatigue plays tricks on you in snowstorms. Distance collapses. Patterns form where there are none, but the lights didn't disappear. They stayed with me, drifting at the same speed, rising and falling like they were following the contour of the land beneath the snow, except the ground there was flat, completely flat. My grip tightened on the wheel. I could feel my heartbeat through my gloves. The truck's cab felt suddenly smaller, like the cold outside had seeped in through the seams. As every time I glanced back at the road, the lights seemed to creep a little closer, moving in lazy arcs, weaving toward one another, then apart again. A sharp gust of wind hit the side of the truck, making it sway slightly. For a split second, I lost sight of the lights in the swirling snow. When the wind died and the field came back into view, the lights were closer, much closer, arranged in a loose semicircle that matched the length of my cab. I slowed instinctively, suddenly aware of how quiet the storm had become. Snow fell thickly but made no sound. The world felt muffled, held in place. The lights hovered, almost level with my window now. Their glow was pale and cold, casting faint illumination on the snow that didn't look reflected but absorbed, like the snow itself was glowing back. I told myself they were flares, or maybe distant rescue markers carried by the wind, though the field was too vast and too untouched for that to make sense. I considered pulling over to get a better look, but a deeper instinct, something old and primal, told me not to stop. Not here, not while those lights hovered just beyond the edge of the road. I kept moving, hands tight on the wheel, trying not to look directly at them. But my eyes kept flicking back, drawn by something I couldn't name. As the lights shifted positions again, this time rising slightly above the surface of the snow. For a moment they aligned in a perfect arc, almost deliberate, like they were observing the truck rather than accompanying it. Then one of them moved directly in front of me. A pale sphere glided across the highway, barely above the pavement, slow enough that I didn't have to brake sharply, but fast enough that I couldn't look away. It felt intentional, like it wanted me to see it clearly. Up close, the light wasn't a single steady glow, it shimmered like it was made of threads of cold fire twisting together. As it passed, the temperature in the cab dropped sharply, fogging the inside of the windshield. My breath turned to mist in front of my face. The truck rolled through the space where the light had been, and for a brief second, the engine sputtered before catching again with a jolt that rattled the dashboard. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel sweat forming under my coat despite the cold. The lights regrouped on the right side, drifting farther into the field again as if giving me space. The storm thickened around them, swirling in strange patterns as if the snowfall bent around their shapes. When I reached for my phone to mark the mile, the screen showed nothing but static for several seconds before flickering back to normal. Finally, after what felt like an hour but could have been only minutes, the lights began to fade. Not disappear, fade like embers cooling slowly. They drifted deeper into the snowfield, their glow dimming until the darkness swallowed them completely. The road opened ahead, the storm easing, visibility widening. I kept driving, unable to shake the cold weight sitting in my chest. When I reached the next town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there with the engine off, listening to the ticking of cooling metal and trying to steady my breathing. A few older truckers were inside, drinking coffee, talking about the storm. When I mentioned the stretch of road just casually, just asking if the visibility had been bad, the conversation fell silent. One of them, a man with weathered hands and eyes that looked older than his age, asked quietly, "Did you see anything out there? In the fields?" I hesitated, then nodded. He exchanged a look with the others and said, almost under his breath, "They follow the storms, always have. People see them when the snow's deep enough. Best not to stop when they do." No one offered more than that. I still take that route sometimes, but only in summer when the snow is gone and the fields are just empty land again. And even then, on the rare nights when fog rolls in and the world turns pale, I find myself gripping the wheel a bit tighter. Because in the corner of my eye, I sometimes think I see a soft glow in the distance, drifting, waiting, keeping pace with me just long enough to remind me that winter comes back. And so do the lights in the snowfield. Night on the road has its own way of revealing things we aren't meant to see. These stories linger because they remind us that even the most familiar routes can hold places where the world thins out, where silence grows too deep, and where something watches from just beyond the headlights. Long after the engine shuts off, images stay with us: drifting lights, empty mirrors, shadows that seem to follow the curve of the highway. They settle into the quiet the way snow does, slowly and without asking permission. If you felt that quiet weight while listening, that strange sense that the dark stretches a little farther than it should, you're not alone. Every driver, every traveler knows the moment when the night feels different, when the road becomes too empty and the world around you seems to hold its breath. These stories weren't loud or frantic. They were soft warnings from people who spend their lives moving through places the rest of us only pass once. And sometimes the experiences that stay with you aren't the ones that shout, but the ones that whisper from the edge of the beam. As you return to your own quiet tonight, let the world shrink back to what you know. Let the hum of your room replace the hum of the engine, and let the dark settle without demanding anything of you. And if you find yourself drawn to nights like this, slow, unsettling, and strangely peaceful, you can stay close. You're welcome to subscribe or simply return when you want another story whispered in the dark. But for now, rest easy. Let the highway fade, let the mirrors go still, and let the night close softly around you. Whatever travels those long roads after midnight, it won't follow you home, not tonight.